My name is David Hebert, and I am a professor in the Faculty of Education at Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. We have a special keynote speaker here joining us today from Nairobi, Kenya, and she will be addressing the issue of cultural diversity in higher education. This is one of the very first times that Bergen Summer Research School has had a keynote speaker from the field of arts. Our emphasis has tended to be scientific discoveries and policy, but the arts is also quite important in terms of cultural heritage and bringing meaning to human life. And particularly in terms of cultural differences, we find that the arts is an important field to examine more carefully from an interdisciplinary perspective. Let me tell you a bit about our keynote speaker. Emily Akuno is much more than simply an accomplished scholar of arts. She is also an important international leader of arts organizations and in higher education in Africa. She has worked as leader of the UNESCO-affiliated International Music Council. She is currently the president of the International Society for Music Education. She is currently a full professor at the Technical University of Kenya, and she has recently worked as vice rector for academic affairs at the Cooperative University of Kenya. She's an accomplished scholar, and I have here one of her books. This is called Music Education in Africa, Concept, Process, and Practice, recently published on Routledge Press. I think you'll find that Emily has really important insights to share with us that are applicable to many different fields, not only music, but in terms of cultural heritage, cultural diversity, and higher education. So please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Professor Emily Akuno.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening from where I am. And I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to join you. I always feel like thanking my very many music teachers without whom I wouldn't even appreciate any concepts around music and music education. And those who've organized this summer research school. And David for the invitation. And you doctoral candidates, thank you for allowing me to disturb your peace. So just a little bit, equality and inequality, knowledge access and development with focus on arts education. Does culture fit in? How can culture be a mitigator? The abstract that I shared basically indicated a little bit about the field of research and scholarship. And I think it is an open gold mine to those who might desire to get into some discoveries, whether it is getting new information or finding further truths about what has already been made known. There is, of course, growing evidence that some of the research output has been put to good use. And I think in education, quite a lot of it has been put to good use. We also know that some of the output is probably a little too early for its time, but unfortunately, not all research outcome is used for the good of humanity, and that's just perhaps human nature. In our wisdom, we tend to, sometimes we divert knowledge to our own advantage, even if it is at the disadvantage or at the expense of our next door neighbors, including the environment. When I look briefly at research reports, I see disparities in contexts, content, objects, and subjects of research. There is inequality in the provision for research. There is inequality in the beneficiaries of research output. There is also inequality when it comes to access to the discoveries that can be appropriated effectively. These inequalities and inequities that plague teaching and learning are not confined to or only manifest at a global level. I think there are disparities that cut across geographic and economic contexts. So concepts in education and the attendant terminologies I find arise out of socially constructed contexts. These are the scenes of the processes of human existence. The intellectual position that is portrayed or presented in education reflects a worldview that is held by the planners of education and often verbalized in ways that reflect the culture of the designers, the consumers, and the producers of the education. Since education with its supporting arms of research and knowledge management are primarily human endeavors, I want to think about culture, that human attribute of identity and function, as a means to understanding inequality and equity in access to knowledge and the generation and dissemination of knowledge. Culture, I believe, should further provide justification and an anchor for equitable and perhaps just means of supporting higher education, research, and knowledge transfer. Perhaps the presentation might look at the concept of knowledge and its application with reference to some of the themes of the summer school. The matters of ethics may not be covered that much, but then a little focus on the question of the role of culture in understanding and addressing equality, perhaps versus equity in access to knowledge and higher education research might just be mentioned. Recently on LinkedIn, I came across this quotation from Paul O'Brien: "A city that doesn't invest in retaining its culture, preserving its history, and supporting its character is doomed to lose it to the generic appeal of consumerism." Sounds a little harsh, doesn't it? But the notion of education arouses and elicits diverse emotions, images, and reaction for different people. And that usually depends on their background and their experience, and perhaps their current activities and aspirations. When we hear the word arts, it equally conjures images in visual, sonic, and spatial formats, often influenced by similar parameters, the individual's context. These are, however, both human engagements, education, and arts. And I believe that they're deliberately fashioned to meet certain well-articulated ends. And some of these ends, the designers can justify, but they may not necessarily always find moral justification. Globally, when you start with the definition of art and education, you move on to its justification and you end with its implementation. Both education and the arts are presented in diverse formats and spaces. These differences alone allude already to both disparity and disparateness in the provision and practice of education and arts. So briefly, we just consider the contexts of human existence and the prevailing presentations and notions of education and the arts, i.e. culture, in a bid to appreciate the diversities of what characterizes them, their role in human and economic development, and how their various manifestations play out with regards to equality, whether in access to or in the practice of education. Perhaps a question that I may be asking towards the end is if there is a need for equality, and perhaps the possibility and or desirability of equality, and perhaps the implications of equality in education and the arts, considering especially the most recent debates around decolonization, reappropriation, repatriation, immigration, displacement, and other disruptive situations and occurrences, and our endeavors to redress certain situations. So the arts, also referred to as cultural expressions, I believe that they are a reflection of their maker's worldview. They speak to, they speak of, and they speak for the life experiences of human beings in particular contexts. Whereas there may be a general appreciation of various art forms, the nomenclature may differ from place to place. There are places where, for example, like in much of Africa, the experience of the arts tends to be inclusive. In such places, there may not be need to distinguish so much between the diverse art forms, dance, music, theater, elocution, spoken word, etc. because all of these tend to converge in one artistic experience. Indeed, completeness requires that several expressions or forms combine in an event for the same to be meaningful. I believe this happens in other spaces as well, but the African expression recognizes and celebrates this unity conceptually. Thus, a musician might be a multi-talented, multi-skilled individual in some contexts. Music would thus be a multi-sensory event comprising multiple symbols that of course demand multiple senses to decode. These symbols would be visual, pictorial, they would be physical, tangible, they could also be auditory, and they could be voiced or oral. So there is, though, in many of the cultures that I have had the privilege to encounter, a sense of the arts as being functional elements that the community appropriates in diverse situations. One therefore gets a sense that there is serious art, that which requires a certain level of professionalism to generate, and is hence regarded and reserved for highly esteemed or valued events. But there is also a sense of what, for lack of a better word, one would call the classical art. In some communities, it is reserved for rituals of significant transitions in the individual's life, important community events, and perhaps religious activities. But the other side of the coin presents to us the art that we consume daily. Some of us don't like the word consume with respect to the arts, but the arts that we experience on a daily basis. It could be of a more popular nature because it is meant for the general population in both its production and its application. It might serve entertainment role, but it's also heavily educational. Now, the accessibility of these two types of arts may or may not be restricted to particular facilitators or performance contexts. In style and complexity, perhaps this second art for all is a little more accessible. It might not necessarily be inferior to the other type of arts, but it tends to be of a simpler, less complex structure. In music, phrases and forms that lend themselves readily to repetition abound in this category because the audience involvement is assured and expected. And so we come to arts education. You know, there are diverse functions of the arts in society. And if you consider art for all and art by all categories, then you realize that education in the arts is of necessity not equal. I read Kwame 1989 and Ketia 1992, among others, and they remind me that there is learning that is done by the whole population so that they can effectively participate in communal activities that incorporate music. I suppose in the West, that is what we would refer to as general music education. This is what I personally call basic creative literacy, an element of cultural growth and socialization. Kwame also distinguishes the rigorous professional training that involves the development of high-level skills, which really is necessary to produce the professional musician. This, of course, is almost a lifelong process. Whereas the arts, the basic creative literacy takes place in what I'll call the process of living, the latter requires years of focused training. And it is very clear that there are lots of things that one gets to learn when they are becoming professional musicians. So as we consider the various functions of the arts, how equal is access to and the practice of art globally? I believe that the answer to this is really dependent on a community's philosophy of the arts, upon which they peg their value of the same. The cultural expressions, otherwise referred to by the terms that denote various art forms, theater, design, etc., play diverse roles in the life of an individual. The distinction between performance, the performance arts, perhaps the presentation arts, and the participatory or sharing arts is a cultural factor. This is a consequence of society's concept of the role of the arts. And so we have an indication that the function of music is relational. I suppose in the performance of music, in a communal participatory format, it brings people together. The music brings people together. It pieces together roles that are as diverse as they are distinct, yet all are necessary to create the ensemble, the whole. In this format, there is a give and assimilate nature of interaction between the musician and the participating audience. This constitutes a codependency that results in an experience that is satisfactory to all concerned, especially so because everybody contributes to the making of that art. The satisfaction is evidenced in the audience's response as they join the musicians in singing the refrain or dancing, or at least in cheering. One of my favorite authors, Nzewi, indicates that the response or the chorus is the anchor that enables the call to provide direction. It kind of sounds like it doesn't make sense that those who are responding should be giving, should be guiding the one who is calling, the one who is giving direction. But there are situations where there is a distinction between the audience and the performer, and the relationship is a little different. It is not give and assimilate. It is give and receive. That interaction where the musician, the giver, gives and the audience receives. And there isn't much opportunity for the audience to build the music. The roles are not equal at all. But in between these two extremes, of course, lie other forms of interaction that influence the music. And I'm sure we have witnessed, for those who attend or watch jazz performances, where there is a way in which the audience behaves that enables the performer to go a little beyond what perhaps they had intended to do. Therefore, the level of participation is not equal. And as such, inequality also contributes to the distinction of music, art styles, and genres. Such inequality, in my view, is not necessarily something bad. It is a distinguishing feature, a culture-specific and culture-nuanced dichotomy and categorization of players in the music composition performance process, i.e., the music event. But when inequality means deprivation, a segregation that leads to disadvantage in terms of the provisions within the same cultural context, there arises a challenge. Inequality in access to arts and education that are essential to socialization, which in the end enables one to be part of their community, is really socially unethical, in my view. Such a denial of access is akin to what O'Brien lamented about above, lack of investment in the retention of culture, etc., i.e., a denial of access to one's identity. It is such inequalities, in my view, that perhaps expose a large segment of the population to the, quote, generic appeal of consumerism. Don't get me wrong, please. There are accepted popular forms of culture. And yet, when the population receives an inordinate exposure to imported cultural expressions, the unequal access to cultural content that would otherwise enable them to develop a cultural identity predisposes them to the generic appeal of consumerism. Such a community, depending on its ethos, may not have much to call its own culture. And I think that is what Krauss et al. 2020 call ethics of critique. It leads me to question the way society treats its younger generations in denying them the elements of their cultural heritage when or where their own music is excluded from their training. I think it exposes the community to cultural domination, the domination by the culture that is not local, but the culture to which the youth are exposed, be it in school or outside through the media. It makes room for discrimination of arts, especially where some forms are declared cultural to mean backward, and the exclusion from the socialization process of the youth and children is made very clear. That to me is inequality from all angles. A little footnote on that. I keep thinking of cultural music and folk songs as terms that are sometimes used in academic circles to distinguish the local, the indigenous music from the high art, probably Western classical music. Sometimes this gives the impression that that local music is inferior, and to be able to engage in the latter is a sign of sophistication and intelligence. We are, however, at least in my space, we are now poised to make certain that the ones who know their cultural or traditional music are the, quote, elite. They are the highly skilled, the highly trained. The music is, of course, a sign of a grounding in a body of knowledge that enables one to relate effectively with others. It is a sign of their cultural intelligence. It is a sign of their cultural advantage. Briefly on education, what is education? Perhaps as opposed to pedagogy? Several words came up as I was checking this word out: teaching, schooling, tutoring, instruction, edification. Perhaps as opposed to, again, education, teaching, pedagogies, instruction. Several words are common to both. Several synonyms are shared by the two words. Perhaps we should add training to the mix. Is it just semantics, or is one word a lot more inclusive? Or is there a fundamental conceptual difference in meaning and implication at pragmatic level? There is a way that society attempts to inculcate values in its members, and for me, that is education. Often society desires to start this acculturation or this socialization at an early age through activities and materials that engage members and that allow them to demonstrate the desired behaviors as an outcome of developed attitudes, acquired skills, and assimilated knowledge. There's a wholesome transformation that is at once internal, at times unmeasurable, but often discernible in overt behavior, in the quality of relationships that one has, and in the quality of life as learners engage in and respond to the tedium of everyday life. This, of course, goes beyond acquiring specialized knowledge and skills, because it is a wholesome fashioning of the individual to become part of a whole. This, to me, ladies and gentlemen, is education, the socialization, the schooling of emotions, schooling of attitudes, expressions, responses, perceptions, through the development of capacity and ability to coexist, to be productive, to be problem solving, to be sensitive, and to be sensible and resilient, as well as adaptable. Perhaps education really includes all forms of intelligences and literacies, including cultural intelligence and creative literacy. Could education be the answer to inequality? As a human endeavor, education requires humans to perform, to elicit, to spur, to stir, to enthuse, to instigate, demand, promote, and justify or validate actions. It is a cultural phenomenon. For what one group with its set of beliefs considers desirable traits will not necessarily be replicated elsewhere. And I say this because of the word inequality and inequity. And so one community's design for education is not necessarily the same as that of another, and thus the cries for decolonizing the classroom. So where does equality in education come in? Once more, equality is an assumption of a possible sameness, that they are the same circumstances, is the same background, and in such a space, there's supposed to be no disparity in access to or provision of resources. At national policy level, I think it is prudent to try and even out the playing ground for consumers and providers of education. But even when that is done, how learners benefit from these equal or the same provisions will depend on how ready they are to access them, a factor of their own backgrounds. And so I consider access as one of the things that I look at when I'm talking about equality and equity. I look at access as a matter of avail plus abilities, not just simple availabilities, just two words. The question of access to education is not solely a factor of what is being availed, the resources that are being availed, or the provision of education. Is the proposed beneficiary mentally, emotionally, intellectually, and physical available, able to engage in and with these provisions? Is there what is called entering behavior, the type to enable them to learn? Can their past experiences, their wealth of prior knowledge, their developed vocabulary, can these facilitate their recognition of the resources at hand, their understanding of the concepts taught, their performance of the tasks and challenges that have been presented to them, their interrogation of the processes towards articulating trends and patterns? What do they bring into the classroom? Where are they mentally, emotionally, etc.? What is their culture? And can it merge with the culture that is represented by and presented in the learning that is proposed by the environment of the class? It is my opinion that there is gross inequality in access to education, not necessarily because there has been no preparation, but despite the lavish preparations and endowments. In the experience, perhaps, and learning of the arts, this matter of access can be mitigated through the provision of specialized individual tasks that ensure that all learners have access to the arts activity, but allowing them to get involved at their level of proficiency and putting in place parameters that will enable them to build from one level to another. And this reminds me of my own college education. We were in a class of 13, and the 12, with me being the 13th, had had prior training in music teaching and had relevant work experience. I had gone through 4 years of secondary school and 2 years of high school music study, but our music knowledge and skills were therefore rather different. We came in from an equal footing because of our training backgrounds. So our perception of the tasks was colored by these prior exposures to the subject. The class had a way of looking out for me, thankfully, especially in the African music performance class. I had a dance partner who showed me the various steps to the Isukuti dance, especially. And when I was overwhelmed, and I hope that it was more out of shyness than left-footedness, I was given the small drum that kept what was essentially the pulse for this dance's music. So I too danced the Isukuti, even when I was singing the songs and playing the drums, because this music-making activity is an ensemble activity, and all the roles, however seemingly simple, are crucial to its execution. We all had equal access to the learning and dancing of Isukuti, and we engaged in the act of learning and performance at our different levels based on our prior learning, which ensured that we were given roles that would allow us to equally participate. How does the teacher maneuver such a situation where learners need to cover the course content, but will not necessarily be adept at all the learning areas? How does the learner get to actually learn and not give up in despair at the apparently incomprehensible melange of sounds and visual symbols or concepts, etc.? How does one acquire the technique to perceive and follow a single line of thought in all, when confronted with several concepts, irrespective of the area of study? How does education become accessible, and how do the arts experiences become an equalizing space for learners from disparate cultural orientations? I found that in my case, that peer learning worked very well for me. We became a community of learners. Fortunately, there were things that I had done in high school that my classmates had not experienced to the same degree. And so I too had something to offer. We had a give and assimilate experience and relationship. And the question is, can learning be programmed so that learners are grouped in such a way that everyone has something to their advantage and there is no parasitic relationship in the group or in the community, that the inequality is not that obvious? My optimistic self tells me that there should be ways of bridging learning experience gaps when it comes to access, so that the learning and arts practice experiences benefit all for whom it is designed. It might, of course, mean that there would be some extra coaching. And I wonder if inequality could also be viewed or countered or debated from the vantage point of relevance. In high school, I could not handle map reading, and so I quickly left the geography class, much to the shame or horror of my father, while my classmates went on to discuss and draw the maps of the Rhine lines and New York, etc. And today, not many of them have been to the Rhinelands or have been to New York. And I keep asking myself, how relevant was that education to them? So the question of equality and relevance, I think, comes in. And of course, more recently, COVID-19 just unearthed those inequalities at a definitely different level. And I remember in my immediate past position, I was responsible for teaching and learning. When COVID struck, it was my very, I was convinced that learning should go on, especially because the national lockdown occurred 2 weeks before the end of learning for some students and 4 weeks before. And so I urged us all to go online, and the university did what it could to make learning accessible, but there appeared different notions of what should happen from a section of the students' population, and they were very loud about that. Perhaps we all thought that COVID would soon be gone and we would get back to normal, because they said they were going to wait until classes came back to normal. But after about 6 months, when it was clear that COVID was not going away, those who had refused to go in for the online classes noticed that their classmates were going to graduate and that they would not be graduating. Again, inequalities in terms of access. A question is the education provider's motive always appreciated as this provider provides access to learning? In our case, there's no nationwide equality in access to the internet. So hooking into the lessons was going to be a challenge for both learners and lecturers. But the institution tried to mitigate by giving learners access to discounted internet bundles. But even if you had discounted bundles, if the internet access is not where you are, you still can't get in. There will always be inequalities in our communities. How do we, as educators, mitigate this? I think there is a level of cooperation that is needed if relevant experiences in education and the arts are to be availed equally. The consumer, the producer, the planner, the administrator, the society that decides what is relevant with respect to the role that is assigned both education and the arts must share a philosophy of both education and the arts. There is, of course, need to have a common understanding of the rationale, to articulate the place that the two have in creating the society that is expected, and the means of availing or achieving the requisite levels of attainment towards useful and meaningful engagement in life's journey and life's matters. This collective, the community, is really the entity that determines what is moral and what the norms are, and therefore what entails success in achievement and abilities. The community creates the culture upon which educational planning is anchored. And that is why I think that culture should be a very good response. In light of the schools of thought that seek to reverse past positions that have led to inequalities in terms of deprivation, I find the notion of equality an interesting paradox. I think it is a subjective, context-determined, and society-defined concept when applied to learning and to the arts. both of which are opportunities for self-development. What does the community want to be? How does it prepare its members to achieve this? Are all members on the same page with respect to predisposition for the uptake of the new transformative information? If not, what measures must be put in place to either even out the playing ground or distribute roles and training in line with individual people's endowment? And this is where I think talent education fits in, so that not everybody has to play soccer. Some people can play drums. This recognition of inequality has given rise to various sampling techniques in research and in teaching, because we do acknowledge that not everybody has the same knowledge or has the same access to knowledge. I trust that these thoughts will help the Summer Research School to consider further the contextual meaning of concepts and to interrogate their study spaces for signs of inequality, to decipher what that portends for their research process and for their research outcome. On the same note, I do hope that the need to interrogate how culture would be able to mitigate inequalities and how it can contribute to equity in arts education and practice and research can be considered. For researchers, can inequality look like an opportunity for innovation and not necessarily a negative thing, a deprivation? Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Emily Akuno, for a very stimulating keynote speech. For those of you who are participating live, you can now type any questions that you have into the chat. Unfortunately, we'll probably only have time for 1 or 2 questions, but please go ahead. Until there's a chat, I will just summarize a few of the important points. Professor Akuno discussed presentational versus participatory kinds of arts. She mentioned distinctions between education and pedagogy, as well as equality versus equity, and access to education and cultural participation, as well as the important role of peer learning in the construction of community. I am sure we have some questions for her. Yes, the first question we have here is from Jiangyao Wei. She is asking how the online learning of arts influences the interaction between teacher and students, and how would this difference influence educational quality?
Thank you. And again, when we learn in the arts, and let me speak especially about music, we learn by doing, and oftentimes side by side, especially the practical performance and the composition, side by side with your mentor, with your guru. And the online facility provides a distance, doesn't it? There is something that you kind of miss. So that interaction is not as spontaneous, as fast as it would ordinarily be. And the way and how the difference influences the education quality, it is not necessarily negative, because technology is changing every day and it does quite a lot of things. Sometimes the collaboration is spontaneous, it is instantaneous, and so there can be a lot of interaction. And yet, I think those of us who are very social as humans, we feel that our lecturers, our gurus' touch is kind of missing. And so the influence can be positive, especially where there is good use of technology, where there is access to technology, and there is access where access is not just its availability, but the opportunity to use it, the knowledge to use those skills. So it should not necessarily be very negative, but I still feel, as an individual, I feel that something would be missing. There's another question on the risks of using mainstream lines through education for evaluating creativity in art. I think that creativity is a language, and like every language, it gives you the tools for engaging with it. And I believe that creativity and the arts should provide the tools for evaluating them. I hope that makes sense. I think we should look into the arts for the way the arts function so that we can evaluate them using along those ways and using the tools that are embedded in them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Emily Akuno. We really appreciate this keynote speech. I think we've learned a great deal from it. Thank you, everyone, for joining.